Sinha translates classic, modern, and contemporary Bengali fiction and non-fiction into English, and English fiction, non-fiction, and poetry into Bengali. Over 80 of his translations have been published so far. Besides India, his translations have been published in the UK and the US in English and several European and Asian countries through further translation. He is an associate professor of practice in creative writing department of Ashoka University and the co-director of Ashoka Centre of Translation. That is the shorter bio that insisted on. So I'm going to just add to it because I want to show off my collection when given a chance. So this is the recent one that I read and absolutely loved it. It's called The Chieftain's Daughter. Then I also have Mirrored Life by Ravi Shankar Bal. And this is one of my all-time favorites, again, Dozaknam. So I absolutely love every of your work that I've read, and some of them I have read the original version also, like The Chieftain's Daughter. I've read the original and I've read the translation. So I absolutely love them all. But what
Very correct.
I would like to start off with is uh, what I know that you choose most of the books that you translate. So, what about a book is it that gets you excited enough to pick it up for translation?
But that has changed over the years. So if you are asking me now, right now, what excites me is when I hear a very distinct and unique voice
Mhm,
without necessarily considering whether the writer is part of the canon or whether they are revered already or whether they're completely new. What really matters is whether I'm listening to something that I've not listened to before, and I'm deliberately using the word listening because
mhm,
for unless I can hear the text in my head, it doesn't come alive. So this also often ties in with the background of the author. It turns out that they also even inevitably end up not being in the mainstream, whether we are talking about the economic and social mainstream or the urban mainstream or the literary cultural mainstream for that matter.
mhm,
The most exciting voices now seem to come from, outside of the core area. And I also look at, because it's going to be translated, sometimes the book is wonderful to read in the language in which it is written, but it sometimes is not of a kind that may travel across languages into a reader who is not part of that same cultural framework. So that's also something I keep in mind. And in fact, it turns out that the more um, the book is localized,
mhm.
more actually it is possible to take it across. It's when it tries to talk of a more universal experience that it gets worrying, because then people start comparing it to their own experiences.
Ah,
And then, then there's trouble. But if it is very unique, where the reader knows this is never going to happen to me, this is just not my the part of the world where I am, then
mhm.
everything in it becomes exciting.
Completely new experience for the reader.
Exactly. Exactly. No frame of reference, no nothing to compare it to. And so everything is a wonder.
Yeah. I was wondering, like you said, the more unique the situation or the conditions, the better it is. But that also means that it must be more difficult to translate it, to put it across in its original form.
In some ways, yes. And there's this thing that I never tired talking of this, that we in India, as translators, we're in a very different place from translators in the West. Because there, at least when you're talking about those translating into English, they mostly translate into their own language and out of a language that they have either learned or they have picked up in the course of some time spent where it is spoken and so on. But mostly, and this is not a generalized rule, but mostly they've not lived in the language from which they translate, right?
Mhm.
Whereas we live in our languages, and so we are always very anxious because we get so much about the text written in our own languages, we're always frightened. Am I going to be able to take all of this over into a new language? So that anxiety can sometimes even be a little bit paralyzing. So, one has to overcome that and just say that look at what excites you about the book and make sure that that is protected in your translation.
Mhm.
Very often we get bogged down by things like, oh, but this is the you one sort of lamentation you'll always hear from translators is the dialogue is in many dialects. How do I get that into English and so on? I'm saying this is actually mostly a problem you cannot solve. So instead of brushing your head over something that is difficult, if not impossible to solve, look for the problems that you can actually address and address those.
Mhm.
And if a text is very well written, I found that it can be translated. The trouble is when you try to translate a mediocre text. That is when you get into trouble.
Uh, this kind of also covers my next question, but I'll go ahead because I think there might be some more points to cover. That what are some of the things that you have to keep in mind while translating, so that because lost in translation is such a big thing out there. So what are the some of the things that you have to keep in mind to keep the original
Yeah.
text intact as much as possible?
Yeah. So the question is, where does the original text lie? Is it so firmly bound to the language in which it has been written that it cannot be taken out of the language? Or is there something lying just behind the language, and the language that has been used for the first version is a sort of projection of that on a wall? That there's something in the author's head or in their worldview, in their imagination, and then they're translating that into the set of words in which I'm reading them. Right? The
Mm-hmm.
moment you start thinking along those lines, then you can free yourself to a great extent, because there are many words and phrases that do not have equivalence between two languages. And you can spend your entire life worrying how to in my case, everyone asks me, how do you translate Naka and Obhiman and various other quintessentially, supposedly quintessentially Bengali experiences, which are reflected in quintessentially Bengali words. How do you translate these into other languages? And my answer to them always is that if the concept does not exist in another language, that's why they don't have a word for it. So if you're going to try to explain a concept that does not exist for people in their language, you're not going to succeed. It's never going to work. So why try?
Mm-hmm.
Find other means, find other ways. It's a state of mind. Find ways to convey that state of mind. You can maybe open it up a little bit, or you can uh, arrive at something close but not 100% accurate. But always remember that each language treats its material differently, and instead of wringing our hands over what we supposedly have lost,
Mm-hmm.
um, Umberto Eco called translation the art of failure. And the idea is there not that it's a way to fail, but that failure itself is an art form, and it you must do it exceedingly well. And what does he of course doesn't explain what he means by failure, but in my head failure is just that thing which tells you that you're never going to be 100% congruent with the text that you're translating once you've translated it. So that difference will always be there, and that is the failure, if you want to call it failure. So how do you do that brilliantly? Right? So that you create in the reader's mind the illusion that they are reading the text the way it was written. Because that is how we read it. When we read 100 Years of Solitude in English, we assume that this is the book that Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote, right? Or if you want to look at something more contemporary, when we read, say, Convenience Store Woman in English, in Gina Mori Taploki's translation, you assume that this is Sayaka Murata.
Mm-hmm.
Murakami, for that matter. You read J. Rubin and you think, I'm reading Murakami. You're discussing Murakami with friends. You don't tell your friend, hey, let's discuss J. Rubin's translation of Haruki Murakami, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that illusion is there in the reader's head. So that's fine. Now your job is ethically to make sure that by and large, overall, they read the same book. Are they reading exactly the same word at on every page, exactly the same thing? No, it's not possible. The language doesn't allow it. Your experience uh, in the language that you're reading it does not allow it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And sometimes we don't even realize these things. For example, I've spoken about this before elsewhere. Take the word river. Okay, when we read about river in Indian literatures, in the literatures of India, very often these rivers are very wide, right? They'll run for miles, 7 8 miles near their delta or estuary, and they're usually not the width of a drain, right? But a reader reading in the UK thinks of a river often as a very narrow kind of stream, right? So are you able to, you may think that you've translated it because you've used the word river where the Indian word for river is used in the original text. In fact, you have not translated it at all because you have created a completely different image with your use of the word river.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can't help this, right? Now, you may, if you get conscious about this, you can say a very wide river. You can say the river running 7 to 8 miles wide and so on, which the writer does not have to do in the first version of the original text because they already know the reader is thinking of the same thing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, there you are. Shoham Amader Choto Nodi, Little River. Yeah. I remember once I was ticked off very roundly by a lady in the UK for saying somewhere, referring somewhere to the searing heat of May, because she said it's never hot in May. What are you talking about? Yeah. Or but that is a very specific bit of data. But what about the fact that for us summer is a time of suffering? Yeah, this is something that many readers in the West will not get because for them summer is the best time of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these are, therefore you will not be able to appeal directly to these experiences from their lives. They have to learn these ideas.
Yeah.
That's what translated literature does for you, right? It gives you ideas which are not already there in your head. And so things that we take for granted when we are reading in our own language will not be taken for granted by the reader when they're reading the translated version. So even if you, by some miracle, did a perfectly accurate word for word translation, you would still end up with a very different reading of it.
Yeah. So, I read an article where you were quoted saying that we are translators every day. Are all of us translators without realizing it? What did you
Absolutely.
exactly mean by that?
Absolutely. Think about your daily lives. You're always moving from one mode of expression to another and moving between them, right? And you're dealing with people who speak in a different language half the time. You yourself are switching from one language to another. Your thoughts are in one language. We don't live a monolingual life at all in India, right? It is not possible. Even in places where there is one dominant language, even their life is not monolingual. You're forever having to move between languages and between versions of languages. Not everybody even speaks the same version of what is supposedly the same language. Every time I hear translators talk when they translate from Tamil or Malayalam, for example, each one says that we are translating a book from a Malayalam which is only spoken in one corner of one island on alternate weekdays by like that specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then we're moving between these languages all the time. Think of yourselves how all of you are, you're from various parts of India, right?
Yeah.
Um, how many of you don't consider Hindi your mother tongue? Could you put your hands up, please? Okay, right. You don't consider Hindi your mother tongue, but do you not use Hindi every day in some form or the other? Yeah, can you think of an entire day, 24 hours or waking hours of a 24-hour day that you have spent without using a word of any other language than maybe just the one, whether it's English or Kannada or Gujarati or even Hindi for that matter? So we are all translators. We are always moving between languages and we do it very comfortably. It comes very naturally to us, right? We grow up in multilingual environments and we absorb them.
Mhm.
Almost everybody in India has three languages, at least.
Yeah. So, I know from your Instagram you're a voracious reader. So, how does your job affect how you read books?
Fortunately, no. But I still, what happens is that when I'm reading and I come across, especially if it's a translation, I come across a turn of phrase or a way of putting something which I know did not originate in the English language.
Mhm.
I just know, oh wow, this is how they have rendered something from Japanese. Then I make a mental note of it, and having a very poor memory, I immediately forget it. So it is of no practical use to me in the long run. But at that moment, it fills me with a lot of joy because I know that someone somewhere has solved a translation problem in a fantastic way, which I really admire.
Okay. But
Yeah,
then
without,
you're
but I want to say one thing. I want to say one thing, which is that if you want to translate, you have no option but to read at least 100 times the number of books. At least if you're translating one book, you should have read 100 books. Yeah, in each of the languages. Uh,
so at least 200 books.
at least 200 books. Yeah, 100 from the language in the language from which you are translating, 100 in the language into which you are translating. It's very obvious, right? You can't learn how to write unless you are reading, and you can't learn how to read unless you're reading. And both a translator does both. Writing is only half their job, reading is the other half.
Yeah. So, does your approach to the craft change depend on the text that you're translating? Like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay and Mukhopadhyay, they have very different style, and one is a classic, one is a contemporary. So, but in terms of both language and narrative, does your approach to the craft change?
So, no, the approach doesn't change. The approach is still to be as true to the text as I possibly can, to be led entirely by the text and not to think beyond it. So, for example, if I'm translating Bunkim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who wrote the original of the chieftain's daughter,
Purgesh Nandini.
Durgesh Nandini, I think in 1856, I think it was published, or 1857, around that time, 4 years before Rabindranath was born. And he was 26 years old. Um, so I'm not thinking, wow, this book was written 170 years ago, but it is the text that is placing it in a certain context. Similarly, when I'm reading Debaruti's Bangla, I'm not thinking, wow, this was written yesterday, but it is the text that places it in that same space and time. So in both cases, I'm led by the text, and then of course, when the text is a little more distanced from your everyday usage of the language, you will spend more time decoding it or deciphering it. I had to run to the dictionary many times when it came to Bunkim Chandra because he wasn't even writing in the Bangla of his time. He was writing in a high Sanskritized literary kind of language. So
Yeah,
it's twice removed in that sense.
yeah. So, since understanding, the author's lens is also an important aspect of translating, does the gender of the original author come into play while translating? Do you?
I it should no, it should not actually, other than no, having it in your head. But again, you are led by the text, and if the gender of the author is evident in the text, then it will come through automatically, right? Very often it does because the concerns of authors of different genders are sometimes unique. So they will come through. The perspective will be different. So these things will come through the text itself. But to presuppose knowledge of the author's viewpoint or their attitude or their politics or their position can sometimes overload your translation. You may start adding things to it that don't really belong to the text, but because you have somehow um, internalize this notion of the gender of the author, you go and insert it into the translation. Now, this is different from when you are deliberately trying a different kind of translation. For example, when Emily Wilson is deliberately trying what she calls a feminist translation of the uh, classics,
Hmm.
of the Iliad, Greek classics, Iliad and Odyssey, then it's a very different choice that she's making, right? She says that she knows it was written by a man, but I do not want this translation to read as though it is written by a man. So that's a very clear objective or agenda, if you like.
Mhm. So just a reminder to the audience today. If you have any questions for Arunava, please put them in chat box and we'll address them after I am done with my questions. Please put them in the chat. Yeah. So, do you, like for contemporary authors, especially, do you ever approach them to discuss or understand their take on the book? before translating?
Not before, but sometimes if there is something in the text that is not even ambiguous, ambiguity is fine, but sometimes that genuinely is eluding me because I'm not able to penetrate the surface, then sometimes I do ask them if they're available for a little bit of clarification. It's difficult because, authors have moved on from the text. So maybe they wrote the book 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And now suddenly you say, on page 77, you wrote this. Can you please tell me? And they're more fox than you are because you have just read the text. They last read it maybe 15 years ago. So it isn't always even as though they can give you a precise answer.
Can you give us tell us about some instance where you had to approach an author and had a
Well,
discussion?
I will give you an example of an author, I will not name him, whom I sort of very, with a very wide smile, I went up and told him that I am going to be translating your novel. And he said, that's fine if you want to, because it's obviously not going to be as good as my version of it. So after that, there was no question of asking him anything. But the same author since then has been very kind about the translations. So I think he was taking a position about translations, but once he read once, and many people have translated his books, I'm not the only one. And once he's read those translations, he's been much more generous with his appreciation.
Okay. So, I think one of the things that I would like, and most of us would love to know, like, what are the opportunities do present day translators have? How can one look to get started?
Well, if you're talking about literary translation, I'm assuming that's what you're talking about because they're and not the technical kind, right? You're not talking about translating documents and so on. So there are two or three interesting options. An emerging option, and I'd certainly call it a form of literary translation, is subtitling.
Okay.
It's arguably a larger industry than publishing, and it is highly challenging because there are very specific constraints within which you have to work when you're subtitling, right?
Mm-hmm.
uh, you have to use as few words as possible. You have to make sure that your subtitle can be read very quickly so that it does not distract from the viewer's experience of watching the film and so on. So that's one. Second thing is, um, what you actually work on translating works of fiction,
Mm-hmm.
non-fiction, poetry, etc. The interesting thing nowadays is that not every translation has to be book length in order to get to readers. The internet offers a great opportunity. I'm not talking about posting on social media. That's always available,
Mm-hmm.
but there are a number of online magazines and journals and spaces where you can start experimenting with short stories, translations of poetry. So that's a very distinct second opportunity, and that's how you build a certain reputation for yourself, so that then when you go to a publisher, you can tell them, look, I've had these three or four things published in reputed online journals,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll take you that much more seriously. um, it is very important nowadays to also look at translating not just fiction, but also essays, longer forms of writing like books on history, books on science, books of politics, books of sociology, as long as they're aimed at the lay intelligent reader and
Mm-hmm.
not at an academic audience, there are tremendous opportunities there. Another very big area, which is relatively untouched in India and really perhaps needs more attention, is children's literature. I mean, children's books are the biggest category of sales among trade publishers, but most of the books that people buy here are books published abroad. So
Yes.
while children's literature also has a problem of getting dated very quickly, and sometimes, as grown ups, we think that the books we loved as kids are the same books that today's kids will love, which is often not the case.
Not the case.
And then we force it down their throat, which is why kids hate reading because their parents are forcing them to read the stuff that they liked 30 years and 40 years ago, which is the surefire way of ensuring that your kids never enjoy reading. But that apart, there is still good stuff there that can be translated and translated effectively. So
So,
there are lots of opportunities, yeah. Not all of them. If you expect to make a professional livelihood out of translation, no. it cannot be your primary source of income. It will never be, right? But it's pretty good for paying for your travel, paying, the way you have to think of it is, what I earn from my translations will pay for a holiday, will pay for my tickets to go somewhere, will pay for maybe a new set of clothes I want to buy, or some really expensive books or device or something that I'd like to get, and so on. So it
So
truly,
it
those
will be
earnings
the
can enhance
jam.
your. Sorry.
It will be the jam to the bread and butter you get from your day job.
Well, I hope you have some jam in your day job as well. If you eat bread and butter every day, that's a very boring life. But yeah,
Eh,
yes, you know what I mean. Yeah.
yeah.
Maybe it'll allow you all those high calorie cakes and things that you shouldn't be eating every day.
Okay. So do you have a favorite child among your books?
No, don't ask me that. Oh, that's very difficult.
Eh, okay, what if I say you can name two, three
Okay, I'm
out?
looking at my shelf. Okay, so books I have a soft spot for are okay, I'll name three, all right.
Okay.
One's a book of short stories by Ashapurna Devi. And the reason I have soft spots for them is really that I think somewhere I found something truly magnificent in these books. So Ashapurna Devi's short stories, which to my mind are one of the most underread
And
forms of literature across India or across the world, even for that matter. I think there's more to be had from her short stories than many other books. I did a set of stories by her. That one, Akhtaruzzama Ilyas's Khwabnama, which is probably the finest novel I've translated. It is set in what is now Bangladesh, in what is now north of Bangladesh, in the years just before and after independence and the partition, and it is truly an amalgamation of history, memory, some magic realism, subaltern writing, um, everything that really goes into a fine novel. Individual characters, and something that transcends the here and now to become really timeless. And the third is a personal relationship with a novel of Buddhadeva Bose's, which was called Tithidod in Bangla. In English, it was published as When the Time is Right. It's a story about five sisters and their father, but mainly the youngest sister and her father.
mhm,
And it is not so much, it's the storyline is unimportant. It really is the is the depiction of a certain the end of a certain kind of life and the beginning of a different kind of life. So this is set in the 1940s, just before independence, when the feudal class of Bengal and Calcutta are disappearing, and a new moneyed class driven by business and driven by quick opportunities created by the British after the world during the World War, and before they leave India. So it's a clash of worldviews and values, and it's told in the most delicate, exquisite, and tender terms. It is not a harsh novel at all. It's beautiful in the real sense of the word beautiful, and it doesn't do it with very obviously adorned language, but the language itself is like poetry, not in a difficult way, but just in its sound and music and melody.
so that's couple of books more added to my TBR now. And with that fear, like I know that you have a book of Bengali short stories coming up with Penguin this year.
Yeah,
Wha-
that was commissioned by Penguin UK. They
Mhm,
have this series where they do publish these collections of short stories from various languages or countries. So, for example, the Penguin book of Italian short stories was edited by Jhumpa Lahiri,
mhm,
and the Penguin book of Japanese short stories is edited by J. Rubin, whom I was mentioning.
mhm.
And so this book is in that series. It's called the Penguin Book of Bengali Short Stories.
So, can we get any sneak peek about what kind of stories are included in it?
Well, it's a vast survey. So it has 37 stories, starting with inevitably Rabindranath and coming down all the way to contemporary writers. The latest last story in it, not the last that appears, but the story
Latest.
which was published originally, the closest to our times, was published as late as in 2015. So you're really talking about more than 100 years of short stories. And frankly, I had to stop at these 37. I could have added another 37, which would have been equally good. So I'm
Okay.
hoping in vain that they'll ask me to do a second volume. They won't, but maybe somebody else will.
Okay. With it's been 80 books already, 80 books old already. So is there a dream project left, or do you think you have done it all?
No, no, several dream projects are left. Several. And I'm hoping that I can take a break from having to earn a living and just work on those at some point of time, sooner or later.
Okay. Okay. So we'll start taking questions from the group. So Debulina Roy, she says, could you tell us about transcreation of text? Is it very different from translation?
Okay, can you tell me what you mean by transcreation? It's a word that I'm not quite sure of the meaning of. Devolina?
Yes, sir. So I've basically grown up in New Delhi, and although my Matribhasha remains Bangla because I'm from Bengali parents, but I have loved Hindi as my, overall language as well, other than English, of course. So, transcreation is the word that I came across many years back in New Delhi. I saw a book lying on my father's table. Someone had, transcreated from Russian literature to English. I asked my father, what is transcreation all about? He told me it's just not only translation, but it has many more elements in it. But then he said, since he's not an expert on that, he's been a journalist. So he said, you can keep your question for the future and ask someone who's into it. So, how do you transcreate a text?
Well, I
Do
would
you
imagine,
bring the.
yeah,
Hmm.
I would imagine that it is retelling a story and then doing things to it the way, to bring it closer to the story you actually want to tell without
Is it
necessarily
like adapting the original story
you
in
could say,
another land?
suppose so. I suppose so. I suppose you could say that. I'm not exactly sure what the
Hmm.
word means, except that I imagine that it refers to a vast range of activities, which where you are using a starting the story as in its first version as a starting point, and then you're doing your own version of it, perhaps in a different language, or even for that matter in the same language. In fact, if you come to think of it, this is how the Indian epics passed on through the generations. They were transcreated each time because people modified them, they added bits that they thought were relevant, they took away, they changed the characters or the way the characters behaved and so on. So very often the version that we read today are not necessarily exactly how these texts began their lives. So I'm all for any form of retelling a story as long as I know that there's you in it, that you've retold this story and you're not calling it a like we are not reading Tolstoy. We are reading you ex Tolstoy. So that's fine then, as you would say in today's remix terms. So Devolina in ex Tolstoy is fine.
Okay, so the next question is from here. Any texts on translation as a skill and philosophy you would recommend?
Well, there are three books you could read definitely. One is Rita Kotari's book, which came out last year. Just take a look at it. It is heavy on theory, but nevertheless, it gives you a great understanding. The other uh, three books I talk about, four actually. There's one by Kate Briggs called This Little Art. There's a book by, there are two books, well, the other three books are by three famous translators. There's a book by Daniel Hahn, who's written a translation diary on journal of one of his. Not one sec, give me a moment. Let me get the books for you. Yeah, here they are. So this one's called Catching Fire, Daniel Hahn, the translation diary. It's a journal he kept while he was translating a novel. So it's really fantastic in terms of going into the specificities of translating a particular text and also making some general observations. Second book that you could really read with great pleasure is Gregory Rabasa's If This Be Treason. Rabasa was, as you know, Garcia Marquez's translator. He also translated many other legendary authors from the Spanish. If This Be Treason is a series collection of his essays on translating. And then there's Why Translation Matters by Edith Grossman, who was the other translator of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's, as it happens. And hers is perhaps the most beautiful, fundamental introduction to the whole craft of translation, why, how, what, etc. So you could read this very profitably indeed.
Mhm. Okay, next question is from Vaidehi. She wants to know, should a translator also be an author himself or herself?
Well, a translator is an author. I mean, whether you consider yourself a published author in the sense that a Jhumpa Lahiri is an author is not the point. The point is you're writing. Those words did not exist in that particular sequence till you put them together, right? So that's what you are, a writer in any case. Do you also write books that are not translations? Not essential. The best translators or the best known translators of the world were not, they did not write books that were not translations. So at one point, the two arts, they diverge. Although some of the skills may be the same, the arts, the craft themselves diverge. So yeah, you don't have to have your
Uh,
own
if they
book.
happen to do both, will it lead to a conflict?
No, why should
Not
they?
necessarily.
Not
Okay.
at all.
I mean,
In fact,
wearing two separate hats, two different
that's
times.
why many well-known writers were also translators. Yeah. For example, Vladimir Nabokov.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's not a problem.
Okay, so the next question is from Anam Varsi. As a translator, how do you navigate through or translate the essence of the language of silence? How does that get represented in translation?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question because translation is really not so much about tr- taking the words that are there as the things that are not explicit, pardon me, the things that are not explicitly there, but which you hear nevertheless. Those silences on the page, but the silences which are which the reader fathoms. So there is no simple method, but what you have to do is you have to validate. After your translation, read it to yourself and see if you can hear the same silences. If you can, you've succeeded. If you haven't, you have to go back and try again. But your translation itself has to be of the text. The question is, has your translation then achieved that business of making the reader hear the same silences as they did, for example, as you said, when you read Harold Pinter's plays? I know this sounds like a very mystic kind of answer, but really there is no formula for it. So this is the only way to go about it, validate. And this is true of most things in translation anyway. It's not that you can say this is how to achieve X, Y, or Z, but the important process is first you identify that X, Y, and Z are the things that I see in this text. And then when you've done your translation, you have to go and see, am I seeing X, Y, and Z in the translated text as well? If you aren't, you have to go back and fix something. I
Okay.
don't know if this answers your question, but honestly, I don't have a ready-made answer.
No, that actually made a lot of sense. So Shoham is asking, is it necessary for a translator to have established credentials or can one start anew?
You have to start anew. I mean, you can't start with 10 translations already there, right? Then when you did those 10 translations, you were new. So of course you have to start afresh. And first time translations have often won awards. Like the JCB prize that went to Mustache, that was Jayashree Kalathil's first translation. So the problem is not being a first time translator at all. Perhaps the problem is whether you're translating the kind of work that that publishers are interested in, or whether you're being heard, whether you're getting a chance to have publishers read them, and so on.
Okay.
In
So,
fact, first time translators are often much better than translators with many books under their belt, because for two things. One is that you have the you have the courage of the uninitiated. You don't know, you don't know how difficult it is, so you just go into it and you're not worried. And the second thing is that because you're fresh and you're not jaded, you can do something really good sometimes.
Okay, Arupam is asking how a piece of text should methodically be taken into good piece of translation.
You want an answer to that in 2 minutes?
I, I was wondering.
Yeah, I can hardly answer that so easily. Um, I don't know. I mean, you just have to be a fantastic reader and a very good writer. Uh,
Arupam, you might want to consider joining the translation course that Arunava is going to take soon with HWR. It's an online workshop. Please consider joining that. Then you'll get your question answered with leisure.
Yeah, yeah, but I'm also a bit worried about this methodically thing, because that sometimes, you tend to think that then you can break it down to a set of steps, and that become more like writing a computer program, and that's really not how it works. Because despite all the things anyone can tell you about what goes into writing in general and translation in particular, there is still that bit of magic that just comes, and you can't identify what it is. It's not like a master chef holding back their recipe secrets. It genuinely is something that just falls into place. All I can say is practice a lot. Reverse is the single most important thing when it comes to translation. As I said, read 100 books each in each of the two languages and practice like crazy. Don't, like, classical musicians, when they learn music, what we call sadhana, you don't straight away, when you're singing with your guru, you're not singing for an audience. You're singing to improve your ability to sing, right? So think of it the same way. Translate a lot and keep translating. And then, all these individual elements that we think of as separate elements will also, you'll start internalizing them, and they'll fall into place and come out together.
Okay. So there's another question from Prachi. She's already gotten an answer from the group itself, but still, who are these people behind subtitling? How to find this community?
Yeah, there you are. You've got your answer. There are some organizations, you'll have to Google them. There's a very big organization, I forget its name right now, which does subtitles for a whole bunch of Netflix and Amazon and other series and shows and so on. If you Google them, you'll find them for sure.
Yeah, I think we have covered all the questions. Do you guys have any other questions? Please put it in the chat quickly. In the meantime, let me just I just mentioned, Arunava will be taking a translation master class in April. So it's an online class. So if anybody is interested, you can sign up with us. The sign-ups are open right now. And Arunava, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for taking out the time.
Thanks so much. Lovely talking to you and lovely meeting all of you.